Welcome to the MIT ID Innovation Program podcast. This is a repository of insights by thought leaders and practitioners of innovation where they speak about their views, insights, and experiences. Come join us.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to yet another exciting initiative by MIT ID Innovation Program. On behalf of the core team, we are grateful to be amongst you all hosting day 2 of the MIT ID Innovation Grad Show 2020. For those who are joining us for the first time today, we'd like to inform you that MIT stands for the ever-progressive, 4-decade-old Maharashtra Institute of Technology. ID stands for MIT's 15-year-old Pioneering Institute of Design. MIT ID's latest contribution to strengthening the global innovation ecosystem is the one-year innovation program, which focuses on the 4 pillars of design, business, technology, and humanities. The key differentiators of this one-year course are a hands-on, highly customized, pro-practical, project-heavy based learning, deep immersions, and humanities. We tested our agility, adaptability, resilience as a team when we seamlessly delivered value-add experiences to our student innovators and the world at large via 32 industry interactions during the pandemic. More lined up as I speak. We take this opportunity to announce about our online open courses, which will commence this quarter. The duration of these certificate courses will range from 2 months to 9 months, in addition to our full-time one-year campus-based course. We also take this opportunity to announce the Global Innovation Network Initiative, which will be led by MIT ID women innovators of the foundation cohort and the freshers. On the occasion of MIT ID Innovation Program completing its first year of educating and nurturing innovators, we are pleased to have you join us at day 2 of the first ever Virtual Innovation Grad Show. The week-long Grad Show will have several industry interactions lined up for our foundation cohort of innovators and the innovators class of 2020-21. A virtual send-off where the foundation cohort of innovators hands over the baton of innovation to the next batch to keep the creativity and energy flowing into the most impactful journeys ahead. So we warmly welcome guest speaker, innovator Rasagy Sharma, who is the principal information designer at Gramener, with a focus on narrating business insights through storytelling. His areas of interest include information visualization, data art, creative coding, and sketchnoting. Prior to his current role, he worked on designing data visualization and interactive applications at Mapbox, Barclays, Microsoft, and Capillary, and helped kickstart the Information Design Lab at IDC, IIT Bombay. He holds a MDes in Information and Interface Design from NID and a BE Honors degree in Computer Science, BITS Pilani. I, Priya Dhawan, Head of Collaborations, Branding and Outreach for the MIT ID Innovation Program, welcome you all once again to this thoughtfully curated innovation journey. Please do read the chat for other important pointers being shared. And over to you, Rasagy. We look forward to knowing more about storytelling.
Perfect. Thank you so much for inviting me and having me for this session. I'm really excited. I see a good crowd, I think about 50 folks. So this is happening via Zoom or webinar. So just in case you're not familiar with that, I'll just reiterate that you will not be able to unmute yourself and speak, but you can use the chat and I'll be actively looking at the chat in case you have thoughts, you have questions, or you just have a comment to make. And if you have specific questions that you want me to take up at the end of the session, there is a Q&A option as well in the bottom of your screen. And those questions I'll make sure we look at the end of the session. We have about 2 hours for the session. So I'm going to structure it slightly loosely. I'm happy to move some things around to accommodate specific interest areas that you may have. But we'll broadly look at it from the bigger picture of what is data storytelling. We look at some examples, and then we'll break down the process of creating a data storytelling. Since this is remote, it may not be as easy for me to do everything hands-on today. So we'll pick the most interesting bits that as designers or folks who are interested in designing data stories can do, while I'll give you prompts for something to do on your own in case you want to take your own data set and build a data story. So with that context, let's get started. I will share my screen and I'm hoping you can see this. All right, so the goal of this session broadly is introduction to data storytelling. We'll walk you through different aspects of data storytelling, but to take a step back, if you've not heard of data visualization and data storytelling, or you've not seen the kind of work that Gramener does, this is a quick view. So at Gramener, we take business insights and then we narrate them as stories. They mostly look like this. They would be a dashboard, they'll be a collection of visualizations, but there are some nitty-gritties here that are not as easy to spot. And that's what this session is mostly going to be about, everything that is hidden behind what you finally see. But before we even get into all of this, a big question that I normally get is, can't I just show the data? Or why do I need to show charts? And a lot of people who come from technology background or data background feel that they're more familiar with just reading an Excel. So they would ask you, just give me the numbers, I'll make sense out of it. And to really set this context of why data visualization, why do all of this, I want to give you a very quick exercise. So I have a bunch of numbers and I want you to quickly see how many numbers are above 100 and drop the answer in the chat. I'm also hoping this gets you a bit eased into the Zoom interface if you haven't used that before. And I will keep the chat open as well for me, just in case I can see what's happening. Are folks able to add something on the chat, or has the chat been disabled? I got a message from one of my friends that the chat might be disabled. All right, some people are using the Q&A. Do we know if the chat is disabled? I just want to confirm that or not. Okay, yeah,
it's enabled. It's just enabled now. Yeah.
Wonderful, perfect. Thank you so much. Sorry, and I think thanks Aparna for pointing that out. So yeah, I can see some answers rolling in. We'll figure out what is the right answer in a bit, but this is great. A lot of people are saying 6, some are saying 5, some have found 7, which is interesting. And the broader question really was how many numbers are above 100. So this is good for us to ease into this conversation. I'm going to ask you another question. So let's wait. If you've not answered it till now, that's okay. I'll give you another question to answer. How many numbers are below 10? It's the same set of numbers. Now the question is, how many of these are below 10? This hopefully should be easier to spot. You can see all the single digits here. And let's see who is the first one who can answer this. Okay, Ashutosh, Sunair, Yash, Rashmi, perfect. So I'm seeing some answers again, somewhere around 6, 7. Folks who are taking some time to count, figuring out whether it's 6 or 7. That's great. Let's take another pause and let's answer this last question. Now this is the trickiest of all three, which is which quadrant has the highest total? And by quadrant, I mean one of these sections. Is it the top left, top right, the bottom left, or the bottom right? Now you cannot set an ad, so don't even try and do that. But what you can do is take a guess based on which of these 4, top left, top right, bottom left, bottom right, would have the most total. Yeah, Ashwatosh is saying Q4 bottom right. Path is also agreeing with that. And I'm hoping a few more folks would start noticing that, right? Some still are undecided. Sasha said this bottom left, and I can understand you might be seeing some numbers that are big enough. So this is a good exercise. There are no awards for the right answer, apologies, but there is something that I want you to reflect on now. So we will try and answer the same questions again with very minor design changes to what we just saw. So here is the question on how many numbers are above 100. And I hope you can easily count the numbers here. We can easily see it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And that's easy because I've taken the question that you wanted to know, taken the answer and highlighted it. So the answer is 6. If I look at how many numbers were below 10, I can quickly highlight them and see the number is 7. Right? No points of counting this, Rishikesh and Sharfraz. I'm hoping this is easy. I'm hoping this everybody can easily spot. In fact, if you look at this, all I've done here is I've colored each number by the magnitude of the number. So the bigger the number, the darker it is. And this makes it very easy for us to spot that the bottom right, which I think Rishikesh and a few others also mentioned, was the highest in terms of total. What I want you to reflect on now is the idea that looking at raw numbers is extremely hard. There's only so much that we can remember, we can hold into our memory, and we'll do a fun activity about this a little later as well. Doing a small design change to just a list of numbers can suddenly help us unearth the question answer that we want to ask, which is the value of visualizing or visually showing something beyond just showing raw numbers, right? Apart from this, there are a lot of other discussions. If you've come from statistics, you would have heard about terms like mean, mode, but if not, you would have at least heard the term called average, right? And what an average does is it takes a big set of numbers and it gives you an average, a single number that can adequately represent the set of numbers. Now that is far harder in reality. So what you see on the left is a GIF, and it's a GIF out of a very interesting paper by Autodesk Research. What they did was they visually put different points on an X and Y axis, and they're showing you the X and the Y mean, which is the average, and the X and the Y standard deviation, which is how different are these from the mean. And the goal of this particular visual representation was to highlight that statistically, a bunch of data points may have the same mean, the same standard deviation, the same correlation. However, unless you visually show those numbers in a form like the XY plot, you will not be able to understand what's happening. So all of these different shapes, different kind of scatter plots, even the dinosaur shape, they all are made of dots, which when summarized by statistics, show the same summary, the same average, the same standard deviation, but only when you see them visually do you make sense of what's actually happening in it. And with this, I think I love to point out to this quote by John Tukey. He was one of the anchors in statistics and came up with, I think, the Fourier transformation apart from many other things. And he said that the greatest value of a picture is when it forces us to notice what we never expected to see. And I'm hoping that is something that you hold on to for the rest of the session. The value of visualizing data is where you're showing something that you did not expect to see, some sort of a surprise. Now comes the second element, which is about storytelling, and why should we obsess over this idea of storytelling? If you've seen some of these TED Talks, a lot of people talk about, always start your talk with a story, etc., etc. But what is it about a story that makes stories so interesting? So this is one example. This is a photo of a mug. It's a usual mug. It has something printed on it. The print is actually flipped. You can't actually read what's the print. And this was one of the many objects that were part of an interesting auction that was done by Rob and Joshua Glenn. It's on their website. It's called significantobjects.com. What they did was they took common items that were pretty cheap, about $1, $2, $5. And they did an auction for those items with the only difference that for every item, they had a story that was written by a writer that accompanied the item. Now, just this small change of showing a story with an object made people connect emotionally with the object and value the object far more. And those objects were eventually sold for over $8,000. This, I think, is one of the few examples that I've come across, which I love as a quantified way of showing that just the act of writing a story makes us value something far more, right? And you can see this across other use cases as well. So people tend to remember stories. They will, stick with stories. We've heard so many stories when we were kids, and stories are also useful because they not only are easy to remember, they also help us act on them. So all the Jataka tales that you might have grown up or with other epics that you would have read, they all have some sort of takeaway. Never do this, always do this, etc., which are actionable. The other bit about stories is that people love to share stories. This means that not only would they take action, they can get more people to take collective action. And we've looked at, and there's been a lot of research around this as well, to figure out how do people make decisions. And putting an element of data story in a decision-making context helps make the decision better, faster, and also helps the decision stick. So more people would understand, agree, and act on those decisions. Now, visual data storytelling therefore becomes a critical aspect. It becomes an aspect for analysts, data scientists, not just designers. But if you've seen some work that data scientists, data analysts tend to present, they will present what they've done. They not present what is the message that they've got out of it. So this, I think, is critical for us to differentiate, which is that we don't want to present how we got to some solution, how we got to some concept, what all algorithms or what all data science techniques that we used. We should think about what is the audience going to be? What does the audience want to know from the data set? And therefore find something that is relevant to the audience and communicate that. This is the crux of data storytelling. And our goal is to give you in today's session a glimpse of some of the data stories that we've created at Gramener, and then tell you how to make this happen. However, this is not something new. We've been telling stories of data for a really long time. This is one of the classic examples. This is back in 1850s, England is fighting a war with France. And during this war, there is a lot of deaths, obviously. Florence Nightingale was on the front field. She was a nurse and she was taking care of those that are getting injured in the battlefield. And she wanted to advocate for more investment, more money being spent on giving better facilities for the healthcare around the war fields, basically better hospital conditions, give us better sanitary conditions, give us more people as nurses, etc. To make this point, she visualized deaths that were happening around that time. The way she visualized this was this. So she took the red, black, and this sort of grayish blue wedges for every month. And she color coded them based on deaths that were actually happening on the battlefield versus deaths that were happening in the hospitals due to the injuries in the battlefield that could have been avoided. And she took this message to make a case that this huge set of gray, bluish gray section that you can see are avoidable deaths. If we increase medicines, the kind of nurses that we have, just the sanitary conditions, etc., we can get a lot of people who are injured in the war to get better, and they could either come back to the war or contribute in some other ways in the bigger war. This worked very well, and the war sort of changed, and there's a lot of discussion about how the number of deaths reduced once these kind of changes were made in the policies, right? And this is a classic example of taking data to somebody and persuading them to take an action, which otherwise would have been harder to do. We would have just had discussions of, no, we need better guns instead of better conditions in healthcare to win the war. However, today there is an overload of data. There is far too much data that's being created, and Peter Diamandis says that every second of every day our senses bring in way too much data that we can even process in our brains. And that is important to realize why we're talking about data storytelling today. So while people have been doing data visualization for several years and several centuries, today we have a humongous amount of data being created. Therefore, there is need for us to take a step as data visualization folks, as information designers, as analysts, to make sense of this data, and that is through data storytelling. However, what has happened right now is that there's been a plethora of BI tools like Tableau, MicroStrategy, Power BI, which you can throw a data set in and make a chart on your own. So the natural outcome of having a lot of data has been people quickly moving to tools that can easily give them the data visualized in a way. However, most of these dashboards that people create lack in three major aspects. And this is a quick summary of those. And yes, Abhijit, the recording will be shared. There's a link as well added about it. So there are three things that are unclear on most dashboards. The first being, what question does this dashboard answer? More often than not, people tend to create a dashboard by looking at the data set and essentially making a chart for every data point that they have, which isn't helpful for somebody who's actually going to the dashboard. What would they actually do with it? So the first bigger question is, what is this dashboard even going to tell me? What is the broader goal of this dashboard? Once this is easy, or once this is figured out, the second aspect that is missing is what answer is evident from the dashboard. A lot of dashboards tend to show a lot of charts, but do I get an answer to these questions that I really wanted to know from the dashboard? That becomes the second thing that I definitely feel we can improve. And the last aspect is, all of this information is great, but what can I do with it? Which is, what action should the user take once they see the information? And that's the last bit that we need to always be careful about and think about. We are not creating data visualization or data stories just to tell people. This is not a GK, general knowledge quiz. You're not in Gramener. The goal here is to take an action. So like a typical design process, we need to figure out who will be our user, what is their pain points, and then what do they need to do with the data we visualize. So I'll show you some examples of some studies as well. And with that, I think we'll move into the second half of the session, which will be about the process of creating data stories. But here is one or two interesting examples. We looked at 15 years of US birth data. We took a data set from 1975 to 1990, and we wanted to ask a few questions about birthdays. Are birthdays uniformly distributed, or is there something interesting happening? In USA, are doctors or parents trying to exercise something like C-section that allows people to move the delivery date a bit? And are there any outliers or interesting trends that happen? So we took the birthday data, we mapped it to every day in every month, and the color shows more births if it's darker purple, and if it's lighter, more in light gray or white, it is fewer births. And you can very quickly start seeing some interesting patterns emerge. The first obvious pattern here is that there is a high number of births in September or in August, or even around July. And this is a fairly well-known concept in countries that have cold winters. People are cold, people are indoors, conceptions happen, 9 months later, babies are born. But there are more interesting trends that you see. Relatively few births are happening during Christmas and Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving is this particular week, and then Christmas is 25th and 24th of December, and that's odd. You can also see around Independence or just, around the New Year day, just the first few days of the new year, very few births happening. There are a few other outliers that we can start noticing as well. We can start noticing that few people are born on 13th of the month than the other dates around them. That might be because people consider 13 to be unlucky. There are some days like April Fool's Day, 1st of April, and Valentine's Day, 14th of February, which have very interesting trends in birthdays. A lot of people would love to have their kids on the Valentine's Day, the day of love, whereas nobody wants a kid to be born on an April Fool's Day. And this became really interesting. This literally made the birth data visualization look very close to the overall holiday calendar in USA. And if there was such interesting trends, like number 13 not being so evident in America, what would happen in a country like India, where there is a lot of superstition and there is a lot more biases that people would have? So we wanted to figure out what happens in India, and is there similar trends or different patterns? And this is the trend that we got when we looked at India. Now, this is very different from what we just saw for America. And there are a few interesting bits that I'll uncover to really explain why this is happening. First, very few children are born in the month of August. And then most births are happening in the first half of the year. One might say that because India is not so cold, that whole winter conception thing doesn't happen. But that seems too strong as an outlier for us to have such a weird distribution. We would expect every day then, if it's completely warm most of the time, for every day to be a possible day for having a birthday, right? We also start finding these bands that emerge. People tend to have birthdays a lot more on 5, 10, 15, 20, 25. That's also peculiar, that you would not expect people to wait for a rounded number like 10 or 15 to be born on, or even 7 if you start noticing that. Now, these round numbers are the first good cue to understand that there is some fraud happening. In a data set like this, which is of a natural occurring phenomena, there can't be a unanimous agreement that most of us will get born on 10s or 15s or 20th of the month. So there is definitely something that is peculiar happening. And this is easier to understand because you start noticing that this is a school admission data for about 10 million children. I think this is from Tamil Nadu in India. It isn't the actual birth data, and we don't really have access to the actual birth data when we were doing this, but this is from the birth data that was on their school admission card. And that starts explaining some phenomena here. You can start noticing that let me just go back. You can start noticing that our school seasons tend to start around June and July. And so if somebody was born in August or September, their parents might fudge their birthday to a few months before, or maybe in July, June, or even in May, just so that they would get into school. Otherwise, they'll have to wait for another year to get into school. So I'm hoping some of us maybe are too young to have gone through this, but a few years back, this was happening far more commonly, right? And that is one good explanation of what's happening when we look at the children's marks. And this is even more interesting because you can start seeing that students who were born on the 1st of June disproportionately had fewer marks in exams compared to other children that were born at different times, right? And that's very peculiar. Why would that even happen? You can start noticing that June, or even these dates of 10th June, 15th June, or 20th June, or July would be days where people would have moved their kids' birthdays upwards or sooner. And these would be kids who would be younger than the rest of their batch, which also means that they would not have had the same cognitive development at the time of testing during exams as the rest of the batch. And this became another interesting pattern, that not only do people fudge their birthdays, the change of coming up with a fake birthday actually ends up trickling down later on and impacting kids in their exams as well. So this is one example. I want to quickly show you one or two more examples that are maybe just this one example that is slightly more fun. So we would always have these discussions around who's the best batsman at Gramener. And a few years back, we decided to look at all the batsmen that were popular back then, and then make this particular visualization, which is a tree map. Every rectangle is the total number of runs that the batsman has scored. And then the color is visualized by the average run rate, or basically how many runs are they scoring per over. And that is interesting because you can start seeing while Sachin has had the most number of runs scored, folks like Virendra Sehwag or even Yusuf Pathan, for those who've probably been following cricket for a while, they were the hard hitters. They used to go ahead and take a lot of risks. And so they stand up as the slightly lighter greens, slightly higher in terms of run rate. And other players like Rahul Dravid, Ganguly, even Azharuddin, Vangaskar, these are the few decades back, the players that used to play. They used to follow the slightly older style, not a lot of runs being scored per balls. And so that clearly is depicted here. So just within international ODIs, we could start finding some patterns. But the ability or the value of data visualization is that you don't just have to settle this argument through an average or total number. You could map this down to individual match levels. So now we are seeing every match that this player played as a square or as a rectangle, and that's colored by the same way. How was the run rate in these matches, right? You can start seeing so many matches of Yuvraj Singh or Sachin Tendulkar where they've scored high with high run rates, whereas folks like Rahul Dravid, Saurav Ganguly were known to be stabilizing the game. So they would hold the game, they would play slightly slowly, and the run rate is also very clear in the way they've played. Now, these are all slightly fun examples. I want to talk you through, I'm going to take you through a few examples that are slightly more relevant in the business context. We look at a couple of examples right now. We won't spend too much time on this. First example is this particular visualization that we did for a European brewery. So this was a brewery and they had multiple plants from which they were purchasing raw materials. And the way this worked was that if they were purchasing raw materials from multiple vendors, they were basically getting fewer amount of materials from each vendor. That means less volume discounts, vendors are unhappy, and you are also spending a lot of money in transporting from multiple vendors. Now, when the management of the brewery would go to those particular plant heads, the plant heads would disagree with that. Anything like that is an issue, because they would say, this is our unique plant. In our plant, we have to do this, etc., etc. So what we went ahead is we did a very simple analytic solution like this, where we showed them how each plant performs with their peers. So like other plants, how are you doing? And the way we did this was, for every week in the year, we visualized the total amount that was spent in getting these raw materials, and that's shown by the size of the circle. And we visualized how many vendors was this order from at an aggregate. So was it between 1 to 5 vendors? Was it above 5 vendors, in which case it's about yellow? Or was it above 10 vendors, in which case it was red in color, right? And this became a very easy way for us to highlight most plants have good relationship with specific vendors. They get the right material from a few vendors and they keep their costs down. They also keep the number of vendors down. There was this one interesting plant, which is P plant 126, where you can see the numbers are huge. So the circle sizes are bigger and the colors also stand out. They aren't green, they're mostly all yellow or red, which became an indicator that there was something wrong that was happening in this plant. They were reaching out to far too many vendors and they were trying to get the materials from too many vendors that was not efficient enough. In this case, this became a good visual representation to have this discussion with the plant and try and reduce the number of vendors or orders that they were taking. Eventually, they were able to use this visualization to figure out about 15 million euros of savings that could be done by removing some of these plants which are reaching out to multiple vendors. I'll take you through one more interesting visualization, which was done for a global airline company, which used to do cargo delivery. Their goal was to get cargo delivered from point A to point B the fastest. But there were specific days where there was a lot of delays happening, and they wanted to figure out why are delays happening and when are delays happening. Therefore, what can I do about it? In this case, we started mapping their delays by different parameters. We first looked at shifts. Is it a morning shift, an evening shift, or a night shift? And which shifts tend to have more delays? So the more red, the more delays, the more green, the lesser the delays. So we quickly found out, obviously, that morning and evening shifts were generally days, shifts that were leading to high amount of delays. The night shifts were slightly better. They had fewer delays happening. You can start mapping this out. You can look at every day of the week and the weekend. You can start connecting them together, and then you start finding these interesting bits like Friday mornings are these red, which are particularly bad in delays. Thursdays, which are on an average okay, also have mornings that are causing delays. Now the company can go back and figure out what is specifically happening on Friday mornings. Is it the kind of staff that we have? Is it the lack of availability of specific resources, or different forklifts, etc.? Or is it just the volume of amount that we're getting, which is leading to some of these delays? And therefore, we did the similar sort of visualization. We mapped it out across different product categories, or how much of the shipment is partial versus complete. And this gave us specific aspects where the cargo company could look at and try and reduce the delays. In this case, the eventual outcome of this was 15% reduction in the turnaround time. How quickly were they able to deliver the goods from the time that it took the goods to deliver? Visualizations like these are helpful. They are novel slightly, but they're very helpful to answer the specific question that the person who will be looking at this visualization wants to know about. And the answer gets clearly visualized through visual metaphors, through color, through fading things out, like in this example, to draw your attention. And they're very closely linked to an action. Now that I know that Friday mornings and Thursday mornings are the ones that have high delays, I can go back to figure out, do I need more staff? Do I need better equipment, etc.? I'll skip through some of these other examples. Most of these examples are available on our website in the solutions page. Feel free to go look at it, play around with it. They're mostly interactive. You can try and see the value of visualizing this digitally. Like in this case where we were looking at service requests, like when you call when your broadband isn't working, raising tickets, and then visualizing that in a different way. So it's not just clear how many people are currently waiting for the problem to be fixed. You can also start seeing a lot of problems are claimed to be completed. Then the user, the client, the person who is unhappy as a customer goes back and says, no, you didn't even solve this. What did you even do? And that takes those issues back to the submitted phase and then makes them go ahead. Some of these visualizations were very contextual and became interesting to change the way people were approaching their problems. In this case, the problem of how do I make my IT support staff efficient? And what problem came out was, it's not so much about how quickly you answer the problem, the query or the ticket. It's more valuable to figure out whether you're answering it in the right way. And the fact that a lot of problems are completed and then go back to submit it was a good example of that. There are a few interesting long form narratives that we've done. things like this where we take the same data set and move it around. I will try and maybe come to this at the end of this session, if in case we have some time. I want to show you, maybe I'll skip to some. I want to show you one or two more fun visualizations. So just to take a pause here, this is a visualization that I did for the movie called 500 Days of Summer. It's a non-linear movie. It's a movie about a boy who meets a girl, they fall in love, and they date for some time and then they break up. This movie is interesting because the movie is not shown in a single linear order. It's pretty much like Gajni or some of the other Memento like movie that you might have seen. And I was really intrigued to figure out what happens in this movie that makes the narrative so interesting. Is it just randomly placed scenes or in order to the way the scenes are shown? So I watched the movie again and again, and I ended up making a visualization like this, which shows how the movie starts on the 400th day. It takes you through the journey of how the movie is actually, shown, the screenplay of showing scenes non-linearly. And when I mapped this out completely, I found some interesting patterns. If you look at this, and if you've seen the movie, I'm hoping you can relate with it. If you have not, I'm sorry I've spoiled the movie for you. But if you look at this, the first few days are when they both have met. The pink days are the days when they are deeply, madly in love. And then the purple light days are the days when they have broken up. So these are the days when they are no longer in love, and that's the sort of sad story, the way they end the narrative. What's interesting is that the days where they have broken up, these few days, are never shown in order. They're always shown one after another, between a day when they were in love, then showing another day when they're not in love, then showing a day when they have just met, and then again coming back to a day when they're not in love. So the juxtaposition of showing two different relationship states makes the movie really interesting. There are scenes that are shot in the same location, like this IKEA scene, but there are times when they're in love and there are times when they're not in love. And seeing why the non-linear element of the movie, the screenplay of the movie, was carefully chosen, which is what makes it so interesting, was really critical. And I think that was the beauty of doing a data visualization for something like a movie's narrative. So I'll take a pause now. I know we have a few questions. I'm hoping that are there in the Q&A section. Feel free to keep adding more questions as well. We will get into this aspect of how can I make data stories. But before that, maybe we can take a few questions. Could you help me, Priya, with identifying if there are any Q&A questions right now in the Q&A?
None for now.
Perfect. Okay. So then that either means that everybody is following along very happily, or it means that none of this is making sense. So if it's the latter,
it's the former. It's the former.
Well, we'll find out. I think we're going to have some exercises as well.
Hello. Actually, I joined little late, and
sorry, Vatsal, could you drop your message in the chat, please, and we can follow along in case you've joined in a bit late. All right. If there are other questions that you may have, I see Ashutosh has asked one question, but if there are more questions, maybe you can take a few minutes to add those questions in the Q&A section. If you have broader feedback and comments, feel free to use the chat option to maybe explain what's going on, how you're feeling, if things are clear or not. That'll just give me some cues. Since this is a virtual world, I'm not able to see you all. It'll help to know whether this is all making sense and you're following or not. I will take you forward to a few steps, and maybe
Rasagy, sorry to interrupt, Rasagy. There are two questions which have come up in the Q&A tab.
Yes, I have them open. Maybe I'll wait a bit for a few more questions, then we'll take.
Okay, no worries.
Perfect. Yeah. So the bigger question is, how can I make data stories? All of this is great, but is this a magical process? Can I also learn how to do this? And we walked through 4 different steps of creating data stories. And these steps are then further broken down into smaller steps. But broadly, this is what a typical data storytelling process looks like. The first goal is to understand the audience and its intent. The second goal is to find insights. What is it that is interesting in this data for this particular audience? The third bit is to carve it together as a story to make sure there is a flow, there is a right narration element. And the last element is around designing the data stories. I just want to reiterate this. Designing the data stories is only the last step. There are several steps before this that are as valuable and critical. Just like in a typical design process, or if you've seen design thinking processes, the actual design happens way later. The first bit is around discovery and definition. So I'm hoping there are some similarities that you notice between this process and the typical design thinking or design process that you may have studied at the MIT's innovation program, or if you have studied design thinking separately. So I'm hoping this will give you a clarity on how would you go about doing this on your own. And we will look at each of these steps a bit more in detail. A typical step starts by first asking, who will be the audience? Who is it that's going to even look at this data? And we'll and how that changes the whole perspective of the story. We'll then look at what is their problem. Through typical sort of design process way, our goal is to first unearth what is the problem that the audience wants to solve. That will help you define what your analysis should be. The next goal will be to find the right analysis and then define insights. And we'll use this framework of BUS as big, useful, surprising, as a framework for us to evaluate insights. Next, we will think about the story, which comes from the takeaway and how is it supported or how is it created overall. And we'll wrap it up with choosing the right format. Should I even do an infographic? Should I do a dashboard? Should I do a scrollable narrative? We'll look at what kind of visual design, visualization, as well as specific visual encoding principles that we need to use to get the takeaway out of the story that we're trying to show. And the last bit is obviously we use annotations to make sure the right message is being conveyed to the audience. So I'm hoping these steps give you a broader, clearer picture of what it means to create a data story and how we follow along. I'll take some questions right now from our chat and from our Q&A, and we'll keep some questions for the end of the session as well. So in case your question isn't answered yet, don't feel bad. We'll keep some questions that I think is more relevant once you have gone through this process. Just give me 1 second. I'll just go through some of the questions as well. So there's one question by Abhishek, which is, how can you make such compelling visualization? Is there a way to design the visual shape or form? Right? And that's a question that we will try and answer in the last section of today's workshop, which is, how do I choose which visualization to use? I have some data and I have heard of these chart types like bar chart, pie chart, scatter plot. I don't know which one to choose. So is there a framework? Is there a set of way to choose the right chart? And then once I have a chart, what can I do to make sure the chart helps understand the data or understand the insight? So we look at that aspect a little later as well. I think
we have Aruna L asking, when I have to present the data, should it always be simple so that everyone understands it?
The data may not have to be simple. The data can be complex. The way you're presenting it has to be simple enough for people to understand. And I think that's the difference that I would want to establish here. How would you know whether something is simple for the user? Will be defined by first, who is the user themselves, right? So if you know the person who's going to look at this data set is, say, it's a print article and maybe an infographic that you're sharing on social media. And so the audience is a very general, common audience who's vaguely interested in the topic. Now, they will not be interested in investing their day in spending time understanding what's the visualization, how does it work, can I hover, can I understand? They want to see a broader, quick answer. So that visualization really has to use simplified data set, or at least simplify the overall message so it's clear for them. However, an operations manager at a particular plant, like the brewery plant, now they don't just want a summary. They want all the details that they have access to so they can take the right decision. In those cases, we don't just show the data, or we don't just show a simplified infographic way of representing the data. We try and find what is it that they want to know, and if their need requires a lot of data access, like we had in the plant example. Let me just bring that up again. So like we had in that example, it has a lot of data set. It has a set of orders that are coming from vendors. It also has a section on the left which shows specific products. So there is a lot of data, and we didn't simplify the data. we simplified the way to view it. So instead of making it really complex in terms of trends, etc., we just showing simple circles, simple colors. Becomes very easy for them to decide which data point is the one that needs their attention. So I hope that helps answer Aruna's question as well.
Sure,
So
thanks, Rasagy. We've got Ashutosh Sundaram wanting to know that sometimes no amount of visualizations convert to an actionable item. So what do we do then?
Perfect. We look at one framework, which is what we use as BUS bus. And that talks about why should you make visualization or what should your visualization communicate? And it becomes a good framework for us to even decide whether all the effort that we're doing in making this dashboard is even useful for somebody. So what is the action becomes critical. There'll be a few frameworks that we look at a little later that helps you answer or understand this aspect as well. I also saw Vatsal's message in the chat, which is how do you collect data? So in most of our work at Gramener, we are working with a client who comes with their own problem and they have their data set already in place. For some of my fun projects, like the 500 days of visualization, data visualization, like those require you to manually collect data. So I literally sat through the movie again and again. I paused it about 4 times. And I had a notebook with me where I was noting down every day that was being shown on the movie and the time that it started and ended. So some of those, there are no easy ways to, there are no automated magical ways to convert a movie into a data set. And that has to be done manually.
Sure, thank you. We've got Sunair Raj who would like to know that does final action related to a data story have to be an overt call to action? For example, donate now, register here, etc. Or for example, in the birth data charts, what was the action linked to it?
Perfect. Yeah. So I think some of these visualizations have a direct action. The kind of visualization I showed, like this particular one for brewery, if we look at this particular one that is trying to reduce cargo delays, they have a direct action involved. Some of these visualizations, like this visualization about cricket players, there is nothing that I will do after viewing this, but this is a fun conversation triggering visualization. It's pretty much the same here. The fact that I can, would I decide when to give birth by looking at this chart? No. But it would be helpful to see some of these patterns and then talk about things like fraud in education, which then could be taken at a policy level. This could also be used as a way to persuade people to not fudge dates or birthdays of kids who are in August and put them in school sooner than they should, because there is a direct correlation that we can see of folks who fudged their birthdays and they ended up scoring lesser marks. So that could be an interesting angle from this, right? But some of these were broader stories. I don't think they have an immediate action in place, which maybe doesn't make them as effective as something like this, which has a very immediate action, very specific audience, very specific problem that they're trying to solve. So there's definitely a spectrum here, and I'm hoping this gives you a good example of when the spectrum is well done versus not.
Sure, thanks, Rasagy. We've got another question which says, in case of data visualization for a network, for example, Airtel, Vodafone, etc., that shows a family plan dashboard, what sort of data visualization will be best? Maybe elders will not be able to understand charts in this case.
Right. And this is, I think, a good segue for us to maybe move into the actual bit of the session, which is the process. And we will touch upon this as well as a few other examples, right? So there is no easy answer to this. And we could once say that there might be an audience that does not know anything about charts. So they are not a data literate or a chart literate audience. And for that audience, our goal should always be to make sure that we are showing the takeaway, the summary, the major thing that they should figure out easily for them. So maybe it is a high heading, it's a title of your particular dashboard. If it's a newspaper journalistic article, you would notice that a lot of these articles already have the takeaway as the heading. This is not happening, or you can see the COVID cases are increasing or decreasing, and that'll be the heading itself. So somebody doesn't need to see the chart to make sense of what's happening. They get the takeaway on the top. And this is one of the many elements that we look at in the next few steps. So let's get into this. And if there are more questions of what I'm talking about, or in general other use cases that you've seen, feel free to keep dropping them off in the Q&A section. And in the second half, after we're done with a bit of exercises, we can look at some of those questions as well. All right, let's get into the actual process. So we looked at some of these steps. They are about 9 steps. 9 steps would be too much to take and finish in an hour. So we will look at some of these steps superficially, and we look at some of the design related steps a bit more in detail. So let's get started. First bigger goal for us is to make sure to define who is our audience. If you're a designer, the parallel to this is to define your persona. Defining your audience is always critical because the same data set could be useful in different ways to different people. Now, I might have the sales data of a company. The board wants to know what is going to happen in the next quarter. Will the sales increase? Will they decrease? The product head from the same sales data would want to know which of my products are selling the most. Did a particular product, start getting adopted or getting sold a lot? Or maybe are there more profits in a particular product? The sales head would mostly be bothered about, am I meeting my target? Is my team meeting my target? How far away, below or above are we to the target? So we could have the same data set of a sales data for a particular company, but it would need to answer different questions based on the person that's going to consume it, which makes the case that a single dashboard for sales data is not going to be useful for all 3 of them if you try and take the same thing and give it to every one of them. Right? So they're not interested in each other's questions. They're only interested in the question that they need to know. So we start off first by defining who the audience will be for our analysis. In general, we tend to use this by a role. It may be a head of sales instead of very broad executive role. It's even better if it's a particular name that is specifically going to do this. And this is more relevant in business cases, right? Also, in terms of the research that you can see around personas, if you've done a bit of user research, you have talked to a lot of people maybe of one particular type of role, giving them a name becomes an anchor for you to use in the rest of the process. It just becomes easier to say, Jim is the sales head. And for this Jim as a sales head, this is what we want to do. Next is the harder bit. Now, this bit is what we often tend to skip when we do dashboards for businesses or even dashboards that are focused for a broader audience, which is to define what is the current situation that that person is in. What problems are they facing in that situation? What action can they take or would they take through that particular data point or insight? And then knowing the impact of the action helps you understand if all the exercise that you're doing is even valuable or not. Now, some of these are hard to get initially, and it's okay for us to have as much discussion as we can with our actual users, and then hypothesize and then validate it later in true design thinking sort of testing fashion. But not having this at all becomes a roadblock, because eventually when you're deciding which chart to use, you wouldn't know which chart is most relevant because you don't know the problem or the possible solution that the persona is looking for. So for example, John is the marketing head. John needs to create region-wise budget. So that's the situation that John is in. But he doesn't know for every region, which region has a good ROI. So the return of investment, if I put $1 million in doing some marketing in UP versus $10 million doing marketing in Bihar, which of these would be able to sell the product better in terms of ROI, in terms of return of the investment budget that I have? And this is the bigger question that they want to ask. So if you can help me figure out which region has the maximum return of investment, I can prioritize the region. And now this is the action to prioritize the region. And this will eventually impact the ROI, the amount of money that they're spending versus the benefit that they're getting out of it. Making sure that for any visualization, you write this down becomes critical. And in bigger workshops which are slightly longer, we actually take some data set and go through it. For this workshop, because it's digital, it's virtual, and it's also slightly packed, I'm hoping this gives you something to follow along when you do this with your own data set. We'll quickly look at the 2 examples that I showed you. So the purchasing commodities one and cargo delay one. The customer churn was something that we skipped, so we didn't have to get into it. But really in the purchasing commodities for the brewery, we saw that there was the head of a brewery, Adam, and that's the persona. Situation, they had plants that were taking commodities from different vendors. Discounts were low, the weekly orders were too high. So now the problem was he didn't know which plants or which commodities specifically are an issue. And if you would ask the plant broadly, they would say, no, we're not doing anything wrong. The action, he needs to consolidate the number of vendors that each plant is reaching out to. If we can reduce the frequency, we could increase the discounts, make the vendors happy, also reduce the logistics costs. So this becomes a typical set of persona. What problem do they have? What are the possible action that they would take? And for most of our business dashboards that we've done, we follow this process to make sure that we're thinking it through. Some of the fun projects like the 500 days of summer visualization or even the bird visualizations may not need something as specific as this. They are fun. They don't need to be very specific around the problem. But for broader business problems, I think this is the way to go. The next step, which is also valuable to understand, is what would be the best insight? What would be the best aspect of data that we should show to our user? And this is generally measured on 3 aspects. Is the insight big? So in our plant example that we showed, we could talk about this one plant that has one day on which they got a lot of vendors to give specific orders. But for the rest of the days, it's been fine. So it's a very unique, isolated, small case in a bigger picture. So it may not be as valuable if the insight is not big. It's a pretty small, unique case. The second bit becomes whatever we're telling to the user, is it even useful? Will they be able to do something with it? And that's, I think, the good question that came up before. The birthday visualization may be big. There are some big insights that we're getting out of it, but may not be useful to the common audience. There's not much that I could do with it. So it's not that great in terms of insights. But the last bit that is always critical is to make sure that the insight is surprising. And unless and until our visualization is showing something that is not obvious, it is hard. It's hard for someone to remember it or do some actions on it. So I think this is one aspect that I want you to all remember, which is think about what information you're showing, and is it big? Is it something that stands out? Is it useful for the particular audience? And for the usefulness, you need to define the audience in this sort of a structure. And last, is it surprising? Is it something that the audience would not know? And this generally helps in figuring out what would be a good data story. This is one good example. And the way we do this is for any typical project like the one that I showed you, which is a brewery, we would figure out what are the possible interesting insights that we're getting from the data analysis. So we found a few. The most common commodity was ordered 10 times a week across 2.4 vendors. That's one insight. The number of orders being more is correlated with the number of vendors. More the vendors, more the orders. Or plant P126 was a only plant that had a high number of violations, and specifically on one commodity that is the biggest commodity. Now, these are a way for us to write interesting insights that have come out of a particular data analysis, and this is what you would typically do. The next step that you would do is you would mark them by big, useful, surprising. So in this case, knowing that most common commodities are ordered 10 times a week across 2.4 vendors, this is nothing great. It is not useful. I don't know what to do with it. It's not even surprising. Sure, there is the most common utility would be often ordered, right? So this is, if your dashboard is telling this, it's pretty much missing the mark. It's not very helpful. However, we can look at something like this, which is this particular plant had the most violations. So it's big as an insight. And it was on this specific commodity that is really large. And that also makes it useful. Now I can go back to this plant. I can ask them, why did this happen? What happened in this particular commodity? And why were there so much of violations or huge number of orders? This may not be surprising in some cases, but it is still very useful. So it's effective for us to highlight this or base our data storytelling around this aspect. Similarly, with cargo delay that I showed you, just knowing Friday is when the cargo is delayed the most is not effective. It's not really helpful. Knowing specifically this particular cause of train staff or forklifts are impacting the delay the most is big, it's useful, it's surprising. So our goal should always be to unearth some of these useful insights, not generic things that you have observed that may not be helpful for the audience. I'll take you through this very quickly so that we jump into the actual hands-on exercise, and then we can keep about 20 to 15 minutes in the end for more questions. So when you are doing a data storytelling like a dashboard, your goal should be to first think about the takeaway. This takeaway needs to be pretty much like a story, if you can. So like a childhood tale, you would have a moral at the end of the story. You would have some characters that went through a journey, something happened, they found a conflict, and then they struggled and then eventually answered, the fate came, or they did something, etc. The same applies to business presentations, business dashboards as well. In those cases, summarizing the whole message in a single line becomes critical. And just like stories are, really stitched around a moral, something that you learn, our dashboards or data stories are also stitched around a single takeaway, a key takeaway that you want people to notice. This becomes like an elevator pitch. So if you're doing this for your own data set, after this workshop, thinking this through, thinking about a takeaway as one sentence, what is the one thing that you want the audience to take away? And then making sure that this is unearthed or shown in your visualization the best becomes useful. So for example, this was how our takeaways were for some of our visualizations. In the purchasing one for brewery, we could give them a specific takeaway from the dashboard, which helped them take a specific action. For cargo delay, we could tell them specifically for this airport, these forklifts or these staff need to be trained so that you could do something about it. And to explain all of that, we could use the supporting charts, supporting visualizations to make sense. And with this comes the bigger question of, I have some data, I have now figured out my story. What should I make? Should I make an infographic? Should I make a interactive slide? Should I make a static slide? So this, I'm hoping, is one easy framework for you to follow along. And I'll quickly walk you through how this is done. So you can start by asking, is somebody going to narrate these insights? So just like I walked you through the dashboard versus you doing the dashboard on your own, is somebody going to narrate the insights? Right? And in that aspect, there is a presenter. And then we can figure out, will there be a specific flow? Or can people ask a question about the flow or about what's happening? And then you need to change the data. You need to visually show some aspect. And that can help you decide whether the slide should be static or they should be interactive. The more interesting bit comes in when nobody is there to narrate the insight. So the data is being consumed separately, right? And in this case, you can ask a few questions. Would the audience need to interact, maybe figure out something that is relevant to them? If no, then there is no interactivity needed, in which case we can figure out, will this be printed? If yes, we can go ahead and figure out if it's a poster or a booklet. If it is something that can be seen on a digital device, we could make a video or an infographic, and that I think works well as a format. Similarly, we could see that if the audience needs to also interact with it, maybe there is potential for us to take them through a single story, and that's the scrolly telling. You might have seen New York Times, Guardian do a scrollable narrative that walks you through step by step some aspect of a story. Or you could do an interactive dashboard, which doesn't have a single story. It has a bunch of charts. They're all stitched together for different stories, and you can go around interacting with it. So I'm hoping this becomes a good reference for all of you to decide which is the best format for me to choose for some of these data stories. With this, I think I've been speaking for an hour. I will give us a bit of a breathing break, and we'll watch this very small video, which is going to be a small fun activity for all of you. Let me know in case you're not able to hear the video, and I'll switch my audio, but I'm hoping this works right away. So let me just do a quick test run with this. Is the audio heard? Could you?
Yes, it's audible.
Okay. Wonderful. Okay, then I want you all to pay attention. This is going to be a fun quiz, and I'm hoping if you've been following along, this will be something that you will find valuable.
Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones below stairs, sir.
I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable, arrest Lady Smythe.
But how did you know?
Madam, as any horticulturist will tell you, one does not plant petunias until May is out. Take her away.
And let me pause this. So In case there's some folks who probably weren't able to follow along the audio, this is basically a detective, a murder has happened, and there are 3 suspects. He asks them some questions about what were they doing when this murder actually happened. And he deduces by knowing that one particular kind of plant is never grown in this particular season, that this is the actual criminal. Now, all of that is not really important for us. So as you know, why are we thinking about all of this in a data visualization or data storytelling session? So here is the interesting bit, and maybe I'll let the detective talk you through this.
It's just a matter of observation. The real question is, how observant were you?
So while you watched this particular scene unpack, there were things that were changing in the scene. There was something that was happening that some of you maybe would have caught an eye, and there are a total of 21 changes that happened. If you want to take a stab at it, use the chat box to mention if you notice something that changed from the starting till the end. And let's see how many people can notice things. Yeah. So Sasha says there were flowers that were not there maybe in the starting, but then came up a little later. I think Harni Hemat mentioned rolling pin was replaced. Great, glad that you noticed that. Rishikesh said color of the overcoat of the detective changed, which is lovely. Yeah. And Parth mentioned that the butler changed the object in hand. So now you can start noticing, some of us noticed these interesting changes that happened. Let's rewatch the video, but now from a slightly different view, just for us to see what all happened, right?
Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones below stairs, sir.
I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable, arrest Lady Smythe.
And I hope that gets you interested in the fact that most of us watched the same video together. Some of us noticed different things change in the video. And there were so many things that were changing, but most of us skipped all of that, right? And this is one of my ways of reminding you that while our visual sense is the primary sense, we tend to mostly consume information visually compared to listening, feeling through our touch or tasting, etc. Our visual sense is always so overloaded that our brain decides what to notice and what not to notice. Let's move on. So this becomes important for us as designers of data stories, that human memory is continuously capturing and also forgetting information. There is this element of iconic memory, something that you would see very quickly. It would stay in your memory for about 1 to 3 seconds. And then there is this idea of working memory. So if I asked you to notice changes, then you might have started paying attention during the video, which you did in the second half, as to what is changing. This working memory is where you're actively, consciously trying to notice things and keeping things in your memory, and that generally stays about 15 to 30 seconds. So if I again ask you, in the starting I showed you a bunch of numbers, which of those how many numbers are above 100? Some of you may not remember it because that's now out of your working memory. Some of you may remember it was 6 or 7, but may not remember the exact number. So working memory becomes useful when you're doing a particular action, when you're solving a particular problem. But then beyond that, you will forget it unless you are rehearsing the same information again and again. And then there is this element of long-term memory. So things can stay in your memory for a long term if they were represented maybe in a way, or they were encoded in a way that were unique. So some of the examples that I showed you, like the 500 days of visualization, 500 days of summer visualization, may be something that is slightly unique. So the uniqueness of it, or the way it was encoded, may stay in your memory for a slightly longer time. Of course, this requires a lot more of retrieval. So if I would keep asking you every week what was happening in the 500 days of summer movie, you would keep moving that data from your long-term memory to your short-term working memory. Why do we need to know all of this? It becomes important because this gives us some cues that there is this element of pre-attentive processing. So before I consciously pay attention, my brain is processing something, versus holding information when you're trying to do some task. And broadly, people talk about 5 to 9 chunks of information being easy to remember when they're working. And obviously there are outliers, there are exceptions to this, so this is not a global rule. But information that can be repeated again and again across memory requires us to keep rehearsing it. And that is how it would stay in our memory for a long time. Which also means that if information is unattended to, if I did not pay attention to it, I will not really notice it. It will not even come in my iconic memory, or even if it did, I'll forget it very quickly. If I am some information, I need to make sure that that information is small enough, chewable enough for me to remember. So this element of 5 to 9 chunks of information becomes critical. And if I'm not rehearsing that information again and again, it'll get lost. So if it's a message that you want the person to remember for a long time, you need to give them opportunity to keep seeing the message again and again. And then long-term memory mostly stays with you for a long term, hence long-term memory. However, some of that might still fade if there is not enough retrieval to continuously bring it back into working memory. So I forget phone numbers very often because I am not physically, manually dialing those phone numbers anymore. So it never stays in my long-term memory. Even if I would ask somebody a number and be able to repeat that number right then when it is in my working memory, I would forget it over time. This becomes similarly useful for us as folks who are doing data visualization. And this whole term around visual perception becomes important. So as humans, we are interpreting our environment to process information. It's being done visually, so it's obviously through visible light. And there are some elements of this that we can use to do this visual encoding, this act of picking the right attributes to stand out better. Now, there's a lot of research about this. We will skip all the theoretical bits for this session, and we'll try and get to a slightly more fun aspect of this. So let's look at these set of plus symbols, right? You can suddenly see some of these catch your eye. You can clearly see that the position stands out, with the rest of the plus being in a single line and this plus standing out a bit. You can also start noticing that color stood out here. So in this case, among the set of black pluses, the red plus stood out first, or maybe one of the first thing that you notice. And then there are others. Size, small size, suddenly small. Maybe that's something that caught your eye. Some of you might have noticed the slight rotation of this plus. Some of you might have noticed the shadow, or some of you might have noticed that this is not even a plus. So these attributes that we were talking about before, aspects of length, width, curvature, blur, become useful in an order. So there are some that are more effective and there are some that are less effective. And in the next exercise, I want us to spend a bit of time trying to take some numbers and visualize them using these kind of attributes. Can we give those numbers sizes, lengths, widths, orientation, curvature, etc. So let's take a bit of a break. We are going to stop listening to me and do some hands-on work. So we're going to take two numbers, very small. I've taken the second day of the week, which is Tuesday, that's today, and 8th, that is the day of the month. So these two numbers, 2 and 8, and I would like us all to spend some time and visualize these two numbers. Now, this would have been more fun if we were all in a single room or a single hall, but with the way things are, we will try and do this digitally. So I'm going to drop a link in your chat on Zoom, which will take you to something called Envision Freehand. Now, Envision is a tool that most designers tend to use to share their work. And within that tool, there is an aspect called Freehand, which is a whiteboard-like tool. So I'm going to show you how that looks like and what you would get when you open this link. And then I will share this link with you. So once you open the link, it will obviously ask you to join this and enter some credential, etc. Feel free to skip all of this. On the top right, you can click on continue as guest. Do not log in with your own Envision password. That's not needed. So we all will join in as guests to this particular freehand. And you can give it, you can just give them your email ID just in case they can follow up with you. If you're not so sure, maybe I can give it my official email ID. So my fun email ID that I use for such things. So I'm dropping my email ID. Feel free to uncheck this and go ahead with signing in. And when you're in this view, you will get to see a bunch of spaces. And of those who are not familiar with this tool, there are some action tools on the left-hand side that you will use. So you can follow along the tutorial, or you can quickly see what I'm going to show you. And for those who are slightly uneasy, not very keen, maybe are seeing this on a phone and want to follow along but will not be able to do this, that's completely fine. So I'm going to continue sharing my screen so we can see what is happening on this particular board. So with this, let me send you this link first on the chat. And once you have the link handy with you, you can join this as well. On the left-hand side, there are a few tools. There is this tool for making a sticky note. You can add a sticky note here. You can talk about what are the different takeaways. I'm going to go ahead and say that data stories are memorable and actionable. That becomes one sticky note. I want you all to first do this. So go on to the left section. You can see there is space here for what was your takeaway from the session till now. Get familiar with how to use this tool by adding a sticky note here and just dropping what you've learned in this particular session. So for those who are joining in, you can go to the chat, take the link and join in. Make sure you continue as guest. You don't need to sign up. And I will share the link with all of you now. Yeah, so I'm hoping now all of you can see the link and you all can slowly join in to the Envision Freehand. I'll give you all a few minutes to join in. Once you join in, I want you to first go ahead, drop a particular note here. So use the notes option, add your takeaway from the session. And then if you want to get familiar with how to draw on Envision, you can use the drawing tool. And there are a few tools on the left to draw like a pen or to draw like a rectangle or a circle. And you can get to the second aspect as well, which is which chart do you remember from the session. Since we have a lot of people, I'm going to go ahead and move things around a bit so that there is ample space for us to do this. Perfect, I can see a bunch of folks here already. And for those who are new to this sort of a tool, this is just a fun whiteboarding tool. It allows you to collaborate together. And I think there's another session that's upcoming in the grad show by the team from Neural as well, which is a bit more powerful tool than this. I think this is a pretty simplified tool, which I love to use. Some of the other tools give you far more flexibility and templates to use. So take a few minutes. In the first section, I would want you to enter what did you take away from the session. And once you've done that, on the right side, you can practice some drawing. And I'm asking you to maybe draw a chart that you remember from the session. Yeah, so I've just moved it a bit to the right in case there are some people who are making really big sticky notes. And you can always resize your sticky note as well. Just going to move you around as well. So sticky notes is the last option. You can drop a sticky note and write some note on it. If you want to, if you feel like ambitious, feel free to add those pointers on the right side, which is which chart do you remember from the session. You can write them on a sticky note, or you can even draw them if you want to practice drawing. Yeah. Meanwhile, I will try and do the hard bit of keeping everything in control. Some of these tend to go wild, so I'll clean up, move things around a bit as needed. Some of you might be practicing how to use this tool, which is completely fine, no worries. But I'll unfortunately keep cleaning it up as we go along. For those who are not using the tool, I'm hoping you can continue to at least see what's happening and how people are approaching this. And get rid of some of these big sticky notes after a bit. For others who are not able to open this up, if you want to just drop a message in the chat which says what has been your takeaway from the session till now, I'll be happy to copy paste that and add that as some sticky notes on this board as well. For those who are done adding the takeaway, you can go ahead over here and write on the right side, which chart do you remember from the session? This is more of a warm-up exercise. You can write the name of the chart, or if you want, you can try and draw it as well. And it'll be great if you try and start drawing it, because that'll give you a flavor of how the tool works in terms of drawing as well. So let's take another 5 minutes, I think, for folks to get used to the tools, writing things out, or maybe dropping sticky notes in it. And then we will move on to the bigger question that we have, the exercise that we're going to do. Yeah. Meanwhile, if you are working through, if you want to spend some time asking a question, you can use the Q&A section. And if you want to maybe drop a note about different things that you're learning from the session in the chat, I can add them as a sticky note as well. Just want to make sure that this is easy for everyone to collaborate, and even if they're not on the tool, or they might be struggling with joining the tool, etc. Perfect. Yeah. So I can see Sankit doing the difficult task of drawing a Sankey chart that we saw from the cargo delay. Thanks a lot, Sankit. This is good. I can also see Hanne Himmat. Sorry if I'm apologies if I'm not pronouncing your name right. Who's really doodling the brewery chart very well. That's great. Some of them have written some of these charts as well. So thank you so much. Let's take one more minute and then move on to the actual exercise, that is to visualize the two numbers. And before you get into it, I'll warm you up by telling you some examples of how to do it. Right, I can still see people excited about drawing. This is the service request, or maybe the 500 days of summer shown together. Some more folks are trying to practice drawing the brewery. Perfect. All right, so now I want to ask you to maybe take a pause and come back to the Zoom window if you are on Zoom. Otherwise, I want you all to look at this area, which is how can you visualize two numbers? And I have a big blue area for you to look at and then answer this. I'm going to go ahead and answer this quickly with one or two options, just so that we do a bit of warm-up with this. I could say, I want to look at these two numbers, 2 and 8, and I'm going to make one of the most common charts, which is a bar chart. A bar chart is basically a rectangle where the length of the rectangle is mapped to the number itself. So if this is 2, this is 4 times 2, which is 8, right? And for everybody else who's on the Envision board, I am now doodling something around in the bottom section, which is how can you visualize two numbers? So make sure you look at that for a bit, so you get an idea of what you want to do in the next 10 minutes. Apart from this, I could obviously go ahead and make the other popular chart type. I could say that I want to show these two information in terms of a pie chart. A pie chart is, and I'm as bad at drawing on Envision as you are. So a pie chart is really like a circle. If in case you're drawing and you want slightly smoother shapes, you can choose the right tool. So I'm just going to go ahead, choose the circle tool, hold the shift key so that it's pretty much circular, and delete this ugly circle that I tried making. And I can make a pie chart by saying 2 and 8 can be visualized by showing it somewhat like this. So I have an angle here, and this is 2, which is pretty small, about 1/4 of 8, which is the rest of it, right? So this becomes another way in which I can visually show two numbers, 2 and 8. What are we doing in a pie chart really? We are trying to say that the angle is mapped to the number. So the bigger the number, the more angle of the arc or of the section itself. Now you can go ahead and feel a bit creative. If you know other chart types, use them and try and visualize these two numbers using those chart types. If you don't know chart types, you can get artistic and make something new. There's one person that you can see right below who's trying to make knots and maybe say that out of these 8 knots, 2 of them are filled. And that's a great way to visualize the two numbers 2 and 8. The goal here is not to be very artistic. So don't worry if your visualization is not very accurate, but our goal is to try and come up with as many ways as we can to visualize two numbers. So try not to spend too much time on one way, try and do many ways. In my typical workshops that I conduct in person, I've seen people do up to 10 to 15 ways to visualize these two numbers very easily. And eventually we will look at about 40 ways to visualize these two numbers. So that's the sort of upper limit in case you're ambitious and you want to know how far you can go. For everybody else who maybe is not on Envision, but is just interested in following along, I am going to continue to share my screen and give you a feeling of how things are happening here. And for those who might be trying out things, I'll continue to maybe clean up some of your work. I don't think this visualizes 2 and 8 unless it's a really artistic visualization. So I'm just going to clean this up, clean some of these lines up. Perfect. Yeah, so I can see some folks who've given their takeaways. I'm glad you've identified some key takeaways from the session already. It's going to reorganize this a bit. Always difficult to get a bunch of people to do this together. And I'll take away all the empty sticky notes as well. Try and make sure you check where you are on, and I will avoid following as well. Yeah, try and not present. That way everybody would see what you are, where you are at. And I think that may, what did somebody do something else to this? I'm sorry if I cannot see anything. That's my own view or if it's happening for everybody. Of course, I'm hoping there's no one who's interested in ruining everybody's work by deleting everything. I think that should not be possible. All right, I think somebody has decided to click on present, and unfortunately I don't have access, I think, to change that. Can I request everyone to please not click on the play button that allows you to present? That gets everyone to be disoriented and move to where you are. Just gonna go ahead and close this and close this document and try and do this again. Let's see. Right, I can actually not see everybody anymore. So is that only a problem on my end, or is everybody struggling to see anything? You can reply back on chat. I can try and figure out.
I'm not able to see your screen as well.
I agree, yeah, but I think there is something that's happened and I'm also unsure. And some sort of a technical issue has to happen. So I'm not sure what happened here. Give me a minute and I'll try and debug this. Or maybe we'll get into.
You might need to share screen again.
Yeah, but I'm just trying to figure out first where is everything that we were doing.
Sure.
And then we can get to. So I think some folks have become really ambitious and gone way out of the screen, which may have been the reason why you all have lost where you were. So I'm trying to bring everybody back here. I hope you all can see this. I'm also going to go back and share my screen so that for those who are not on Innovation, they can see what we're doing. Yeah, so just to bring everybody back here, this is where you all were drawing. Please continue drawing, try and avoid jumping into other people's territory. This can become an interesting territorial war. And with this, I think I will stop sharing. Please try and avoid clicking on the present button. That will disorient everybody else. Yeah, I hope this gives us enough view. For those who are struggling, I think maybe somebody added some content far away, and that's what got us very off-centered. Perfect. So I think some of us are trying to do interesting techniques. I can see some artistic ways, some obvious ways. You make a square, you take the size to be as big as the number itself. Some folks here have taken an axis and mapped out 2 and then 8 and then joined them up together with a line, which obviously is a good way to visualize 2 numbers very quickly. I'm going to go ahead and delete this one line, which I think is causing an issue. But this bit of showing 2 numbers and repeating the numbers or repeating entities to show the 2 numbers is a common way. We'll look at that as well in a bit. So I'll give everybody maybe another 2 minutes in case they can come up with more ways to visualize these 2 numbers. And if not, we will quickly get to actually seeing how these are visualized. And we'll look at one example that takes you through about 40 different ways to visualize this. But I can already see some fun, adventurous attempts at making shapes like a car. Ashutosh is trying to draw a car, and maybe there's a metaphor here that I can wait and see if they visualize. Yeah, there are some other more free-flowing circles. There are some that are obviously giving these 2 numbers a context. So in this case, whoever made this took the metaphor of a clock and then said that these 2 numbers actually represent something. Feel free to do that. I think this is a good way to start thinking of how would these numbers actually be if they were for a specific use case. In this case, if these numbers were different time of the day or maybe hours on a clock, how would that be visualized? If it was a time itself, like 2 o'clock and 8 minutes, then showing a clock hand becomes one way to visualize. There are no right or wrong answers. I think this is more of us to open up and try and visually see, experiment and come up with fun ways. Yep. You can be slightly ambitious, make a bunch of colors, circles that are concentric, and then 2 of them are colored by one particular color, and the rest of the 8 are in different colors. And this again becomes an easy way to visually show 2 and 8 as well. I'll give you all another minute, I think, to do this, and then we will walk through one small blog post that I love that walks you through these in much bigger number. Perfect. So I'm hoping folks can see a lot of things happening here. All right, so I think now people are running out of ideas. Some people are going really adventurous on making a candle. Not sure what this is. Some of them are trying to still think about some meaning attached to these 2 numbers. Some are going very adventurous around making a sine curve, and that's always a bit geeky, but fun way to think about the 2 numbers and saying that the amplitude is the numbers being represented. So small height, this wave is 2, the bigger height is 8. Great example, Neeraj, I think, of mapping that out. Yes. All right, so I want everybody else to maybe take a pause. We'll try and remove some of these notes that people might have accidentally left. I'm hoping they're all accidental and nobody's bothered making weird symbols on this particular board. You can start seeing a couple of things here. Some of the easy visual representations are already mapped out. You can see bar charts, pie charts. bunch of squares, some of them are filled, bunch of circles, some of them are filled, etc. And so there is some familiarity that we already have with a few visual representation techniques, and we tend to repeat them. Once we stop this, we get into some wilder examples. There are some examples of making shapes like a car, 2 wheels and maybe 8 people in it. I don't know. But that becomes a bit more artistic. And these can be metaphorical. These can be using a particular context and becomes helpful, not in dashboards, but maybe in art projects, in infographics, etc. So with this, I want us to take a pause of this activity and then move on to this particular blog post. This is written by Moritz Steffner. He is a data artist. He conducts a lot of data art workshops and projects as well. And one thing that I love is this particular project of his, which walks through 75 and 37, visualized in many different ways. So I'm going to go ahead and close the Envision board. We're done with actually trying to do this. I saw a lot of people have similar examples. We're going to quickly look at some of these examples now. If you look here, here are some ways to visualize 2 numbers. In Moritz's case, he's taken really big numbers. I didn't want to give you huge numbers because it would be a pain to really draw them in Envision, but I'm hoping you get the same message across. You could get started by saying that I'm going to visualize these numbers by writing them, or writing them in groups like you would do in a particular jail. You would have seen this in movies like, or TV shows like Lost, etc. And this is essentially chunking numbers together and then writing them down. You can repeat something. You can be an abstract shape. So you can say this is 75, this is 37, or you can give it a meaning. You could say that these actually represent humans. So we're talking about humans. These many humans have X, these many humans have Y, or this is the demographic data. This is a very common way to visualize numbers in infographics, where you want to get some iconicness, some subjectivity. And there is a whole field that was started thanks to Otto Neurath called isotype, which specializes in just using iconography repeatedly to do information design. You can also obviously chunk these numbers up. So you can say that tens are going to be a big square, individual numbers are going to be small squares. I could show 75 like this. Similarly, I could show 2 and 8 in chunks as well. I could make a bar chart like I did. I could make it tall, or I could make it horizontal. So it could be a column chart or a bar chart. I could go ahead and make a line graph. This is something that one of the person had also done, where you say that this is 37, this is 75. I'm going to connect the 2. You can also shade it up together as an area. You could look at it as a percentage. How much of 100% is 75? How much of 100% is 37? You could do the same with 2 and 8, saying how much of 10 is 2, how much of 10 is 8. Or you could take a single section and then split it together. Now, this is just a few, and there are several more approaches. You could start mapping it out in a line, talking about it in terms of intervals, thinking about it in a grid of specific abstract symbols. How much of this is one versus another? You could put it together in a single stack. You could make a pie chart, donut charts. You could just take 2 shapes and size them up by those numbers. You could split it to show the comparison, make it easy for you to compare. You could do several other things, and the blog post really talks you through multiple different ideas. You could take an icon and say the bigger the icon, the bigger the number, or the height of the icon is mapped to the data set, the volume. You could take a metaphor like the metaphor of time, the metaphor of weight. You could also be slightly more ambitious. I think one of the person had done this where they took a dark circle and a light circle to show 2 and 8. So some element of lightness or hue could be used to map and visualize numbers. Geometric progressions, coordinates, angles, latitude, longitude on a map itself is a visualization of 2 numbers, and so on, right? So you could keep going on and on. You could think about the density of a texture and then map it to the number itself. You could talk about how there are 75 dots connected by 37 connections, and therefore this is visually representing 2 things. And you can get very crazy. You can think about sine and cos functions, and their parameters are these numbers, or like one person did, the amplitude, or in this case, the frequency of the numbers, or the wave is dependent on the number itself. And you can even be slightly more abstract, talk about how quickly you're seeing 2 things based on the number itself. So it doesn't just have to be a static visual. It could be something that is animated, it could also be sound frequencies or even more. So why did we even talk about this, and what was the whole point of doing this sort of an exercise? There are two major goals of doing this. One is to make you realize how charts are made, and charts are really made in a very basic way. We take data, we visually encode or connect it to a property, and that gives us a chart. So a bar chart is taking a data and mapping it to length or distance. The scatter plot that you would have seen is mapping position to the data. You could look at a pie chart, which is taking an angle and mapping number to the angle, and so forth. So there are different kind of data sets for which different kind of encoding methods are preferred. I won't get into this sort of theory, but there is a link for you to read through. There are several research papers around this as well, which can help you decide whether this is an effective way of visualizing information. However, what we want to talk about, maybe we'll skip through this and we can come back to this a bit later, is a bigger question. So now I know there are several ways to visualize just two numbers. When you have more data, there'll be even more different ways to visualize this. Now, how do I select which chart to use? Or how do I even know which is the right way to visualize this, right? And this is the question that we will try and answer now in the next 5 minutes. We'll quickly look at some examples of this. And then we'll take broader questions from everybody. So picking a visualization or a data visualization method requires us to ask what kind of takeaway should the user get from this visualization. In this case, we could try and say that we want to make a visualization that helps people explore the data to understand what's happening with their data. Such exploratory visualization focus on magnitude. What is big, what is small, or distribution? How are things spread out? What is unusual in this? Is there something that is standing out? And these become two common ways of representing or answering this question. You may want the people, your particular user that we identified earlier, to specifically look at high or low performance. Now our goal here is how has things changed over time, or how have things changed over space? Are specific cities getting more of our sales versus other cities are not getting more sales? Or if you look at the current COVID issue, people are putting that on the map to highlight which areas are cases increasing, decreasing, and that requires a spatial way of visualizing information. In some cases, we have a goal that you want to reach, like a sales target. And in that case, you want to not look at the absolute value. We also want to understand how far away are we from our target, or have we already reached and crossed our target. So there, a way of deviation becomes valuable. And then there are elements of ranking. Which are the top 3 cities where I'm performing the best? Can we rank that? So not just talk about how I'm doing in each city, show me the top, or show me the last 3, the worst areas where I'm not performing well at all. The last bit is even more critical, and this is something that directly maps to an action, which is to help understand if I'm doing well, why am I doing well? Or if something is happening, what could be a potential cause for this? This could mean that we're trying to find a driver for performance, a driver for a change in data. And that's where correlation comes in play. We could try and look at the biggest of these. So we could look at part to whole. We could try and understand how this triggers across a bunch of steps. And the IT service request example that I showed is one of these examples of flow. So these are roughly 9 different ways for you to think about visualization instead of thinking about every chart as a possible entity. We can now break this up into specific charts. So for each of these sections, we have few charts that come as this part of visual taxonomy. All of this information is available online. So we have a website for this called Visual Vocabulary based on Vega, which is a data visualization library. That's not needed. You can at least have a reference like this for yourself to look at which visualization should be used when. And I'm hoping this sort of a flow chart to decide what is the best use for my particular persona, and then mapping it to different kind of charts would get you to choosing the right chart. There are many other similar categories, similar websites that can be a good reference for you to learn, practice, and maybe try out new visualization types. DataVis catalog is another favorite of mine. It has all the charts, a bunch of charts listed there, sorted by function as well. So you could see I want to do comparison, show me charts that are for comparison. The database project is slightly more pretty looking, also more infographic focused. So it has a lot of unique diagrams, not just data visualization charts. And there's obviously FT, which is Financial Times vocabulary, which is what inspired the project that I showed you, a bit before. So this is directly mapping to Financial Times vocabulary, but using an interactive visualization library. So with this, I'll wrap up with one last point, which is a small design detail that is really helpful for us to take care of. That is around annotations. Now we use annotations to explain charts, explain what we want to show in a chart. And this is, for example, the marks that students have gotten in English in a board exam. Now this is a common trend, and you will start noticing this if you see other similar marks data. But if I would just show you this chart, there would be a few things that you would notice. You would notice that very few people get less than 10 marks. Very few people get more than 95 marks. Most people are getting marks between 40 to 80. However, there is this very weird trend where very few people are getting marks between 30 to 35. And there is this abnormally high number of people who are getting marks in 35. So visualization itself is not enough to communicate the story that you want to communicate. We need to get started by adding some more context, and we can do that by explaining what's happening. So maybe a description of the chart, summarizing what's happening on the top. So in this case, the real summary is that teachers are adding marks to stop some students from failing. Otherwise, you won't expect this sort of an outlier to come up. We can go ahead and actually specify, mark out, annotate, label what is unusual, which people should focus on, which is this. Large number of students are scoring exactly 35 marks. Very few are scoring between 30 to 34. So this is what is unusual about this, right? And these are what we are bringing to attention by annotating. And we wrap it up by adding a takeaway or an action. In this case, some of these students were unlucky because they got teachers who did not believe in giving them few grace marks to help them pass, right? Whereas a few students may have scored less, maybe 30, 31, but the teachers felt it's okay, let's give them a few extra marks. And so they went ahead. This means that there is a difference in policy, or there is some subjectiveness within teachers, and identifying a fair policy that can be applied consistently might be a great way to make sure that fewer people have these cases where they were nearly there and then they were basically failed. So annotations, this idea of summarizing, explaining, calling out specific aspects that are interesting, and recommending an action. These 4 steps really help make sure that all the chart choices, all the other hard work that you've done doesn't go to waste. And a good way to remember this is to remember SEER. So summarize, explain, annotate, and recommend. So with this, I will wrap up our session. I hope this was helpful to everybody. I hope you were able to take something out of this session. And I hope for those who were on Envision, they had fun maybe drawing and doodling the charts as well. We have about 8 to 10 minutes, so we can take a few more questions, and I'll leave you on this slide so you can remember the steps that we went through.
Thank you, Rasagy. Truly insightful session.
Thank you.
In the interest of 8 minutes left, I'll just pick 1 or 2, and maybe the rest of the questions we could mail it to you, and we could have them, answered offline. So let's start with Yash Gupta, wanting to know that what is important to remember when analyzing data, and also is it equally or more important than the visualizing part of the process?
Yeah, so I think this is critical. So the first bit is slightly hard. I don't think most of the people in this audience would be sitting and analyzing data on their own if they're actually working in the business context. But at least if you're doing personal data visualization, making sure that you're following the steps right before it, which is who will be the audience, what is the problem that you want to solve, will be critical for you to rightly or correctly analyze data. So I think it's not so much of which data analysis tool that you use or which technique that you use. It is far more valuable to make sure you're answering the right questions. So the 500 days of visualization, for example, is a fun visualization. For me to analyze that, my major question was, how are the scenes laid? And is there some science or some method to the non-linearity in the movie, right? Now, is it equally or more important than visualizing part? That is obviously tricky. A common thing that I used to remember when we were studying computer science is garbage in, garbage out. which is to say that if you start with the wrong assumptions about the audience, if you do the wrong analysis and you pick an insight that is not big, useful, or surprising, then no matter how amazing your visualization skills are, you will not be able to make any sense or be value to the user, right? So every step before is important to make sure that the steps later on are valuable. You can be amazing at making pretty looking charts that are very interactive, they move around in 3D space, but if they don't focus on the question that the user itself wants to answer, then none of the fanciness is helpful. So I'm hoping this helps you balance. There is no one right answer to this, but garbage in, garbage out. If you're choosing the wrong steps in the starting, the final outcomes will be bad, irrespective of how pretty your visualization technique is.
Super. Thank you, Rasagy. We've got another one from Ashutosh Sundaram. He would like to know, as a follow-up to the actionable visual, some of my clients get too lost in the visuals and the way it looks that they forget the insight. So it is sometimes great, but we work mostly with nonprofits and that is the ground reality. So any thoughts on that?
And I'm hoping the last slide was really focused on, this bit, which was, if you are making a really fancy infographic or you're making really complex visualization, make sure you're able to walk your clients through. And this bit is always done by using a good heading. So don't write a heading which says this is a visualization of English marks. That's not helpful. If you talk about the summary in the visualization, then that would connect, that would give them the major action that they need to take from the summary. And they would be interested in seeing the visualization afterwards. Right? And then you can annotate, you can call out the specific details so somebody doesn't get overwhelmed by the really custom chart type as well. So I'm hoping annotation becomes an answer to Ashutosh's question.
Sure, just a minute. Thank you so much. We've got another one which says, yes, Rishikesh, there are going to be more sessions lined up on this theme. Please stay tuned to our upcoming engagements. We've got another one which says how to select the correct visualization style which works for the user and also solves the problem. This will pretty much be the last question that we'll be taking, and further more questions will be taken up offline.
Sounds good, but I'm hoping this question now has been answered because we looked at the flow chart to pick. We did 40 different ways to visualize two numbers, but now you have a specific method to choose. Are you trying to get your user to explore? Are you trying to help them figure out patterns or the dimensions, or are you trying to give them some understanding of what is the driver? So I think this particular slide that I showed you that came up here. Yeah, this I hope answers that question. How do you select the right visualization style? Before we wrap up, I'll just keep that last slide that I was on again for all of you. Sorry. I am getting lost in my slides. Give me 1 second.
We'll also be having Professor Desai share the screen. So,
all right, then actually let me stop. I just wanted to keep this screen as the last screen. So this has some books to read, some tools for you to think about, and some other places to know more about our work. And you can always find me on LinkedIn, Instagram, or Twitter. Generally active on all of these. So let me stop sharing and over to Professor Desai.
Sure. Thank you very much, Rasagy, for 2 hours worth of talking, and of course so much value add to our audience here. We thank you for your support, and in true virtual life mode, we request you to accept a small token of our gratitude, the certificate of recognition. So we would have loved to hand it over in person, but in the current pandemic situation, this is the best that is possible, safely and digitally. So may I request the head of the innovation program, Professor Harshit Desai, to digitally hand it over to you, please.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you can hear the applause, but in true virtual fashion, let's assume everybody was clapping and they were happy with me receiving the virtual certificate. Thank you so much.
Yes. A few words from Professor Desai, please.
Yeah, thank you, Rasagy. I think this was one of the best sessions that we have had in many of these industry interactions that we had lined up in past few months.
So
essentially, it's something which we all have been really struggling is to how do you keep the engagement on in an online and a virtual mode. So I think spread over 2 hours, it did feel that it was a 2 hour long session, and apart from the kind of trivia and the other fun activities that you did, I think it conveys a very, very important point of how design and data can work together, because in a way,
Right.
these two otherwise are seen as two extremes of the spectrum, right? When we talk about data, it's typically very analytical and numbers and things like that, whereas when we talk about design, it's another world altogether. But I think you have done a great job of bringing these two worlds together. And as we have been discussing, this is one of the interesting areas to look forward to for anybody in this space of design and technology. So thank you for all the effort that you took, and we look forward to further collaborations and take this forward in the best possible way. Thank you.
So a round of thanks to our audience for joining us today, and special thanks to our guest speaker once again for his time and sharing the value-add takeaways from his data visualization journey. Next, I'd like to invite you all to a glimpse into our collaboration with QGlue, which is a design and innovation arm of workforce development and consulting organization. So please save the date. It's tomorrow, Wednesday, 19th August, 9:30 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. It's a 2-hour workshop on experiential design thinking. Please register in case you haven't yet. We also encourage you to connect with us via our social channels to know more about the MIT ID Innovation Program and upcoming engagements and online courses. For those interested in becoming top-notch innovators, we invite you to explore our courses that will fast-track your career path. So log on to www.mitidinnovation.com to kickstart your innovation journey with MIT ID Innovation Program. Let's learn, let's innovate, let's lead. Yours innovatively, Priya Dhawan signing off. Stay connected, stay safe, and keep innovating every day.